Episode 82. Consistency is more important than perfection.
You're listening to the very best podcast in the world on health, wealth, and happiness. Please remember to leave a review and share with all your friends and family. And here is your host, Lars Hilser.
And a very warm welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and all listeners of the very best podcast in the world, your source, your only source in the universe for personal supremacy through health, wealth, and happiness. Now, the top 10 benefits on spending time alone yesterday led to some weird feedback where people were talking about isolation, and people were talking about what isolation did to them, especially during the Rona times. And the feedback was mixed. Let's put it that way. A lot of people didn't understand the benefits of being alone and obviously needed a lot of time together with other people to exchange. So that's why, I just wanted to mention that it's about really extracting the benefits I mentioned and applying them, for your own life and for your own advancement, in that these characteristics or these traits or whatever you want to call them, these exercises can be helpful to getting to a point where you actually can be alone and can spend time alone, and then kind of harvesting the fruit of that rather than, it being a given. So it takes training. Perhaps we should have made an exercise out of that. Perhaps we will in the future. I'm not too sure of that yet. So today is about consistency and why it's more important than perfection. And I kind of went into myself and my history, and it was like the most recent project, which is this podcast, turns out to be if not the prime example of why it's important to get a thing on the road and maybe improve along the way. Now, before I start with that, there's a differentiation to be made. In software, for instance, and especially operating systems, we have seen for the past decade or so a tendency of releasing immature software to the masses and then improving it along the way, kind of like, you're flying a plane and you're about to crash and you want to repair it. And there's the extreme example on how not to do it, because you're risking, the livelihood of actual people when you do something like that, something irresponsible like the software companies are doing. And there's the point on the positive end of this x-axis, which is, there's a point when it's good enough. And, I made an episode about good enough really a while back. Perhaps you want to listen in. The example I said in there was quite similar. I think maybe it was even the same one with the podcast. Only now it's about consistency getting you there, and more about the speed of consistency in context to getting a project done. Because what you have to understand is, if you move towards your goal, it's rather unimportant how fast you move. That's an important point to make. right? As long as you're moving and not laying there dead procrastinating, you're doing something. And that's for a lot of people, those overachievers of you are going to, yeah, what the fuck is he talking about? Well, there's a lot of people who lack motivation, and there's a lot of people who have a very, very, very difficult time getting their ass up and, moving even one step toward their goals. And it's important to realize that it's not so much about the speed, it's just of getting there. That's kind of like the most important point to make in this context. Now, again, and since I've already mentioned it in a previous episode, I'm going to go into the podcast example just because it's the most recent one that I ran into, right? So when I started this podcast, there were a ton of difficulties that I ran into. The first kind of battalion of them, for lack of better words, was that I had a very difficult time solving technical issues, right? So I had a very good microphone, but when I plugged it in, it was making hisses and sounds and shit and background noises, disturbances, and picked up all kinds of crap that it shouldn't. And figuring that out was rather difficult, because it took me a lot of research, and I eventually ended up finding a plugin for my recording software, which then kind of took care of that. Now it was time to start an episode, or to start with an episode should be the more correct answer, to start with an episode that would describe the mission of the podcast. And while on paper it all looked good and the idea was there, it was supposed to be this persiflage against all of those self-improvement gurus and get rich quick gurus and whatever. So it was supposed to be jackassing them. And I very quickly learned that the feedback I got from my listeners was so positive, and that this podcast impacted so many lives, then I had to turn around. So it was, kind of like this God-given that eventually, things turned around and I didn't do the episode. Anyhow, so it took me, I don't know, probably close to a month to get this first introductory episode to a stage where I felt comfortable releasing it, but not really. And so I just started with episode 1 rather than episode 0, which was supposed to be the introductory episode. The introductory episode now is still missing from everywhere. And it still hasn't been produced, half a year, quarter of a year down the line. And I think I'll just give up on it, right? And continue this podcast in the way it was started, with certain evolutionary changes put into it, in that there are going to be interviews with very interesting and influential people, which, will be helpful for you as listeners to kind of, see firsthand on how to make a career which you otherwise wouldn't have dreamt of, just by being convinced about yourself and being in love with yourself enough to convince others that the mission that you're on is worth following. And so, anyhow, that's why, this episode never really happened. I already mentioned in the New Year's episode that I'm producing it, and I've been reproducing it for quite some time, but still to a point where I'm not really satisfied. So it wasn't meant to be. Now, the same thing is about 1.5 decades ago, where I started my first corporate website. And for the company that I'd made, that was in web design. And it took me months to get this website to a degree where I was satisfied with it. The problem was, during these months that I hadn't published it, I wasn't making any money. I couldn't advertise really, because the website was sitting on my own server and I was the only one able to look at it. And the thing is, in retrospect, it would have been very sufficient to launch a first version, which was technically working, which displayed the message I wanted to display to my audience, right? But at the end of the day, I wasn't satisfied because there were some technical gears and bells and whistles in the background, which, didn't really resonate with me. They weren't perfect for me. Nobody would have seen it. None of the visitors would have seen it. It was about loading speeds and optimizing image sizes and, that kind of thing. Nobody on the planet would have noticed it, but I would have. And that's where kind of like this thing about perfection, and I'm far from a perfectionist, but if I go anal on a project, it's like it has to be really, really, really perfect and impressive and memorable to the people looking at it. And that's this memorable experience is what I set out to create with this podcast after the first round of feedback that I got, moving away from the persiflage / satire aspect of it, moving towards something where the stories I experienced or the experiences I made on my journey and in the way I was able to help people realize that they can easily excel in their life and how to do it. That was when, it created this paradigm shift and kind of led this whole entire mission that I set out on ad absurdum, right? Does that make sense? I hope so. So, in that sense, perfection, I think, if we take the title, consistency is more important than perfection. It's like the way you move, the speed at which you move is yours. And it's yours to determine, and it's yours to keep, and it's yours in a very intimate way. And you shouldn't get fucked around by anyone because it's about your comfort on getting something done. Other people who will advise you seemingly or, throw shit at you for being too slow or too fast, they don't know how you function. They don't know at what speed you feel comfortable. And so it's important for you to build up blinders and then kind of take out all of those disturbances from your input channels and really move at your own speed, at your own pace, because only at that pace will you feel comfortable consistently and over a long period of time. And solving a lot of the issues in life is more of a strategic thing than a tactical thing. So you have to be comfortable in the speed at which you move for a very, very long period of time. Because if you become dissatisfied, your entire long-term project is just going to be miserable, and you're going to be miserable. And the people around you are going to be miserable because you inevitably will infect them with your toxicity, right? So it's about getting the whole picture, getting something on the road in incremental steps, moving at your own pace, and at the end, at the goal, to have something that may be imperfect, but on the way toward the goal, you felt fucking comfortable, right? In that sense, send this episode to a friend now, or to many friends through your social networks. Subscribe to this podcast if you have feedback, criticism, or other. Email theverybestpodcastintheworld@gmail.com. And have I forgotten anything? I wish you a successful day. If you have had your successful day, I wish you a good night. Keep your hands above the blanket. Peace out. I'll hear you again tomorrow. See ya.